we'll wait on Vansh to start recording. Yeah. Perfect. So I think we are good to go. Let's start the debate, Prime Minister.
Hi, can I check that everyone can see and hear me clearly?
Yep. Yes to both.
I would prefer, okay, I'm used she, her pronouns, and I would prefer verbal POIs. Give me a second to pull up my timer. All right, the problem in today's debate is that there is no better alternative to promote progressive content without social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter manipulating users' news feeds. And thus, our end goal in today's debate is firstly to increase social progression, and secondly, to improve social media as a whole. And thus, our policy is to encourage and allow social media platforms to manipulate users' feeds to promote such content. So let's set up the debate in the following context first. So we see that both sides are already taking data from the users, and people are already consenting to their data being taken by using social media in status quo. And so we are not defending that data should be taken, but rather we set the context that data is already being taken in the status quo, and we are arguing about what this data should be used for. So what will news feeds look like? News feeds are distinct from personal feeds. And so this looks like having current affairs being pushed out in a specific thread rather than having personal feeds, which looks like personal interests, sports, games, or let's say food recommendations. So what is progressive content? We see that we define it as something that the majority determines. So progressive content looks like what the majority think is considered a progressive content, and we think that the majority is a good actor to determine this because usually the individuals that create discourse for progressive movements, because current popular social movements like feminism require the widespread majority support, and so we just need the majority's acknowledgement that this content is considered progress, and the majority is woke and aware that social movements in general are good for society. And so we'll see through things like surveys what current movements are promoting, etc. And so progressive content looks like things that promote movements and are usually woke statements, right? So moving on to my first argument, how we better gain traction for these progressive content. What is so important about these progressive content? These progressive content promote movement, and these movements need traction because otherwise there is no support and they cannot enact change. These movements look like feminism, LGBTQ+, etc. So why are these movements not getting the traction that they need right now? So this looks like opposition's world, right? Because the way that social media functions in the status quo, it looks like collecting data from users and then using these algorithms to filter through what they want to see and continuously push out what users want to see. So if users keep searching for a certain football club, they will only get content about that certain football club. So unless the user is very interested in seeing movement, they will not get to see these progressive content being pushed out to them, because it is unlikely that users, that the majority of users would want to go onto social media just to see this content, right? So because of this, so these movements cannot get the traction that they need, and because the progressive content is not being pushed out to them, and hence on our side, we want to be able to push out this progressive content. So on our side, it is important that social media is the actor that promotes these progressive content because they are the best actor to do so. We see that the purpose of social media in the first place is to reach out to an extremely wide audience in a short amount of time to spread awareness through going viral, etc. And so social media has the power to control what is being shown to these users, what is how they influence what the users see, believe in, and think about. And so we think that it is so important to expose these users to these social media movements through the use of progressive content, because social media is the best actor to show such a wide spread of audience this content in such a short amount of time. And however, in the first place, social media is very polarized and does not allow for the cohesion in society because it eliminates things like fake news. And so without this sort of algorithm that they are pushing through, this content will not be able to be pushed out. And my second speaker will elaborate on that. So moving on to my second argument about manipulative social media platforms. So what does status quo look like? It looks like people are already vilifying social media platforms. Why is this the case? Because cybersecurity is an increasing concern in countries, for example, Singapore cyber attacks, where the information of many people risk being leaked. So more cyber talks about are being conducted in school and how we should be wary about our online presence. Therefore, the government has the incentive to inform the people about their security. If not, social cohesion is jeopardized, right? So what does this education look like? It looks like teaching students to read the terms and conditions for presenting before consenting, i.e. social media platforms taking your data to predict what content you like. And this proves that society is aware of how social media works and how it tracks our data and manipulates it to do targeted advertising. Thus, people have already become desensitized to the idea that social media platforms are tracking them. But now the difference on opposition is that people will remain distrustful of social media platforms. Thus, advertising these progressive content won't work on side opposition because people are distrustful of social media platforms and they will view because most of the things that they see the algorithm is doing is to push for advertisements to pop up on their feeds as a result of their data tracking, and that the data tracking is not for anything put to good, right? So people won't buy whenever these advertisements are being promoted because there is a sense of unease that they're being exploited for profit by these social media companies. And so the discomfort doesn't come from knowing that social media platforms take their data, but rather it comes from what the social media platform do with this data, thinking that the social media might use it for profit and that they're merely just a result of the companies taking the data and then trying to push out content merely to get their attention, right? And so on our side, we portray social media platforms to have a different incentive structure, i.e. to promote progressive content and enact social change. We give them a redeeming factor to regain trust in social media platforms, and advertising will work better on our side. So social media currently has the power to manipulate, and so opposition is defending the status quo. So we think that people will now think that social media is a more trustworthy platform on our side because now we promote progressive content. And so we think that the government is often a good representation of we will limit this debate to democracies where people have a voice, because we think that the government is often a good representative of the majority and they can represent the people's voice through democracy such as voting. And so the government gets to choose what is considered progressive content as well, which links back to my previous context, citing that the majority is the one that chooses what these progressive content look like. And so social media, on the other hand, social media companies are private companies, which means that currently in the status quo, they're not being transparent about what they do with the data, and it is definitely not showing to the public view. And therefore, we think that on our side, we are better able to ensure that social media companies are being transparent and at least show and give a good impression to the users, because on our side, we are able to put social media to a good use and to be able to push out progressive content. And therefore, for all these reasons, please go side proposition. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Let's welcome Leader of Opposition here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you are audible and visible.
All right, thank you. The vast majority of social media users are completely unable to rationally handle misinformation, and especially an overload of information by themselves. We think that pushing progressive content through the manipulative algorithm harms the very basis of democracy. We're going to first give a further characterization on what social media platforms promoting progressive content actually looks like. We say that 1, the actors would generally be progressive politicians and their campaign teams, as well as other progressive social movements that are capitalizing capitalizing on the widespread use of social media in this current digital age to spread content through something called advanced analytics. Government side neglects the stakeholder of progressive politicians by framing a narrow debate where it's just social movements. Progressive campaigns won't necessarily be very clear messages to users. We also think that in order to engage more people, these progressive campaigns will likely be broad in what they support. For example, not everyone would support abortion rights, and the politicized social media companies wouldn't take the approach of generating big pop-up ads on social media to support Planned Parenthood because they want to appeal to the masses, including conservative users. So what they would rather do is that they would send messages that will be far more subtle and harder to detect as a conservative in order to not completely lose the other side, such as a conservative would see more tweets related to, for example, rape and then abortion rights. We also say that there's an inherent lack of regulation and consent when it comes to the users of these social media sites and how educated they are about what advanced analytics does and how it can target them. So how do we say that social media platforms can manipulate users? We say that they are able to push progressive content through the tool that we told you before called advanced analytics. Advanced analytics is just the automatic process of taking huge volumes of aggregate data of people's demographics, of people's user profiles, what content they interact with, and giving that to organization or political movements so that these social media sites can best assign and target their campaigns to reach a more personal level to connect with users and voters. This is also known as the optimization of micro-targeting people with ads. But when this isn't used to appeal to individuals' likes, but rather manipulating users and pushing for progressive thoughts, it is problematic. On our side, we will later tell you why for two reasons. But first, let's talk about OG's case. Their entire case is based off the assumption that social media users are rational actors and likely to take all the information that is given to them, all the progressive content that they will receive and process it independently, and that they will vote independently with this information. Therefore, if we take this point down, we take their entire case down. So what do they tell you? They tell you that social media is the best actor to expose people to movements because everyone uses it, and that they think that users are already desensitized and already know that social media is using their big data, and so that they are aware, and they think that social media will likely become more and more transparent with this. They concede that radicals and extremists also make social media as a platform a very toxic environment for political movements. But they don't even mention about the moderates who are young, new, and also undecided voters who are looking towards social media for more information to gather on who they should support with their vote. They also can see that social media companies are not transparent with big data, but they never give you a mechanism or explanation of how they would regulate this and how they would change this so social media would be more transparent with how they're actually analyzing users' profiles and what type of information they're sending to users, meaning that users cannot consent to their privacy being literally taken over by these social media companies and disregarded. So they never mechanize why or tell us how social media can be properly regulated. We don't think social media can just micro-target users and push them partial and biased, even if it's progressive content. We say that this then harms democracy and increases the risk of propaganda, and that voters are unable to make an independent vote because they are disrupted by all this political noise. So what are our arguments? We tell you that one, promoting progressive content increases extremism. There's not anything wrong inherently with progressive social movements and calls for change, but the issue is that when it mainly is only progressive content you see is when we see the other side, which is the conservatives who want to then take this algorithm down or sway it to benefit them. They will do so by other alternatives such as hosting mass rallies, buying as many hateful ads about progressives as they can, and go to the very extreme and get their supporters to also go to the very extreme as well, because they can't win the social media algorithm fight otherwise. The impact then is that the healthy political discourse would also go down or disappear completely on social media. The conservatives would want to counteract the algorithm and fight against it by either migrating to their own social media platforms like Trump did and create this entire bubble of and further echo chamber of hate and conservative hate, and creating the space to push people with extreme beliefs to the very far ends of the political spectrum. And they would also they could also pay and post more ads on social media sites that support conservative ideals. And this would overload users with likely misinformation as well too, because these conservatives know that the social media platforms wouldn't equally push their content. So what they have to do is that they have to get more clicks. And how they get more clicks is that they have to be very extreme with the messages they send out to radicalize users and mobilize them and increase their interest. The fact that social media platforms that have become politicized, they are supporting a political side of the progressives, would also increase the battle of the two-party hegemony in places like the US. And what does that mean? It means that, for example, grassroots campaigns and politicians running as independents with good ideas or who identify as moderates have no places in political spaces and social movements anymore because they only push progressive and accept solely the progressive narrative in the political space. You also have no money to pay and overtake the progressive ads that are heavily pushed by the algorithm. And you also have conservatives going crazy and spewing out hateful political campaigns also in their comparative. Then when it comes to policymaking, this is bad because they have worse policymaking on their side of the house because the conservatives and progressives are too busy playing this game of information war, trying to control the socio-political narrative to convince more voters and supporters to sway their way, rather than finding common middle ground and doing what is best for not just one party, but for the entire country. We also say that this can exacerbate situations like, for example, the Senate filibuster, or that the fact that policies can't be made in the US because Republicans support solely one narrative while Democrats solely support one ideal. Then we tell you on privacy. The principle of this argument is that we should not infringe on the privacy of individuals. Social media companies do not have the right to become politicized and use the data of individuals to do so. The premise is that advanced analytics push hyper-specific or even general progressive content to users, and this is something that is very unregulated. OP has never told you how this could be regulated. And how much data these organizations can access is very unknown. And so the use of the algorithm is extremely gray in that users don't know what is being tracked of them. And even if they do, the content that is pushed to them is often politicizing their identities and targeting very specific and vulnerable parts of their identities to manipulate them and make them vote for one way. We do not support this. Therefore, we are very proud to oppose.
I thank the leader of opposition for that speech. Let's welcome Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, do you mind giving me a minute to pull out my timer, please?
Yep.
Hi, it can be seen and heard, right?
Yep.
Just let me know when the lag stops. Also, before I start, I like to say that I prefer POIs and chat, so just type it in and I'll take it. Sorry, Chair, do I have to wait for Amy's iPhone to start? Okay.
You got cut in between and we were not able to hear you. Yeah.
Okay, so I can just start, right? Can I start? Yeah, okay. Hi, will Ming-Shan be able to start? Okay, then I'll start in 3. Oh, by the way, yeah, POIs and chat. Ask if they can hear you. Everyone can hear me, right?
Yes, you are audible now.
Okay, then I'll start in 3, 2. 3, 2, 1. I think that opposition has been running an incredibly negative case. Just notice that throughout their first speaker, they never actually told us what their counterfactual is. Therefore, I think that proposition has every right to assume that opposition is likely defending the status quo, which I'll be telling you why this doesn't really work. 2 things I'll be proving. First, how we increase social progression, and secondly, how we improve the social media industry. First, on social media progression, I want to quickly take this thing of fake news out of this debate because I think that we flip this pretty easily, right? Fake fake news exists on opposition actually because it's usually not seen as progressive content. Therefore, on our side, it's likely that fake news will be filtered out because social media companies, in order to get like all these progressive content, it's likely that they have to run things like algorithms that already filter out fake news. I think that opposition already has a lot of fake news. I don't think that they exactly prove why it doesn't exist on their side. With this out of the debate, I'm going to talk about the second thing. This is the bulk of their speech. This is politicization. But I think that the premise of this, I think that the premise on our side is that we better the lives of vulnerable groups and people on the ground. Because politicization is not really a bad thing. Note that for political campaigns to work, social media is particularly important because a lot of campaigning is often done through social media. Like you post things like policies, which is pretty important in my opinion. Therefore, I think that it's very likely that on our side, these things are going to be boosted to recommended feeds. I think that this already deals with their point of rationality because I think that it allows people to make more rational decisions. This is true because I think that in status quo, Joanne has already told you that news feeds, they're pretty much currently recommended news feeds are pretty much what you're interested in, what you search up. For example, if I'm constantly interested in news about like LGBTQ things, then therefore my news feed is going to be all about that. I think on our side, we actually improve rationality and ability to make good decisions because we therefore because progressive content is not always what people search up. We allow people to look at different things and therefore we actually have more rationality. But I'm going to deal with this second thing on is politicization a bad thing? I tell you it's not a bad thing because they told us about how things like hate can spread. I think that this is very untrue because note that they cannot defend common middle ground if they want to defend their case of having the conservatives talk and having the Democrats talk at the same time. But I think that actually this hate thing is worse on their side because note that when people right, this hate thing is actually worse because note that when people don't want to listen to these conservatives on their side, it's likely that they're going to be posting everywhere about how much they hate everything. And we think that they actually have a lot of power to do this because they're all over the social media pages. I think that they are likely to spread hate either way because I think that in status quo, if the majority already regards things that are liberal as progressive content, it's likely that they want to push forward this hate thing. So it affects them just as much as it affects us. I don't know why to do. The next thing I'm going to deal with is even if things like lobbying exist, because I think that they suggest that conservative politicians will try to push their things forward. I think it's unclear why it's a problem because I think that progressive content is likely to already be aligned with what the general majority wants. I think that Joanne has said that. So a couple of reasons why social media companies are pretty good actors. First, social media companies need to protect the consumer base. It's likely for them to reject the ideals of conservatives in the first place because they feel like the majority of their consumer base already doesn't support it. The second thing is that social media thrives off not aligning with the government and conservatives because this directly deals with their thing of like conservatives because it gives rise to things like movements. I think this likewise develops Joanne's point that these social media people are pretty good actors. But notice that they never actually responded to our argument in Joanne about movements because they just tell us that movements is very unclear why it's a good thing. I tell that actually the foundation of many liberal political campaigns are actually based off social movements because that's what people care about, right? So I think that these movements are likely to be generally seen as progressive. For example, workplace rights for women are seen as things that are absent and therefore people campaign for it. So why are these movements crucial? I think that we reach the vulnerable, for example, historically discriminated minorities. And I think that social media is actually the main form of outreach. For example, we can see like across the 2010s, we have things like the Arab Spring where people in the Middle East actually overthrew a bunch of dictators over social media. I think that this is what we see as progressive content. I think that on our side, we actually filter out anything that is seen that is not really creating a lot of important change for the society. But they never actually responded to this thing of traction either as part of movements. Because this debate isn't about people who strongly support or oppose. It's not about liberals or conservatives. Actually, it's about people on the fence. Because on our side, we rally people on the fence. So what does status quo look like? I think that in status quo, Joanne told you that feeds are currently what people search on. Therefore, I think that a lot of these people on the fence, they actually don't know a lot of things about liberal movements. Know the difference between knowing and participating. Even if they know something, I think that on their side, people never actually try to participate because they don't know the details behind the movements. They don't know the true meaning of the movements and the importance of the movements. And therefore, it's very unlikely for them to get traction on their side. It's very unlikely for them to get progressive change. Therefore, the conclusion of this question is that we actually get more progressive change on our side. We actually better the society because of social media. The second thing is improving the social media industry. The premise is that social media companies are bad actors, but we turn them into good actors. Why? Why this is true? I think that we actually increase transparency because this leads, because I think that on opposition, there are things like malicious and manipulative news feeds, including social media companies. Joanne told you that in status quo, corporations are being vilified because of like existing hate against big tech companies in general. But why is this very bad for social media companies? I think that we quickly take this advanced analytics thing out of the debate because I think it exists on both sides. But given the rise of social media, people have options. For example, Twitter versus Instagram. If I think that Twitter is a bad company, I'm just going to use Instagram. Therefore, this creates the incentive to lobby their consumer base. This also directly deals with that thing of fair elections because, for instance, I think that social media companies are likely to turn to malicious alternatives. For example, we see things like Cambridge Analytica when Facebook decided to sell things. And this arguably impacted the 2016 US election because some people argued that it wasn't fair. So I think that on our side, this changes on our side because things like randomly selling data aren't really seen as things that are progressive. And therefore, this means that we already take this out of the debate because social media companies, they want to be seen as progressive as well to align with their consumer base. Therefore, it's likely that they also want to do things that are progressive. The reason why Cambridge Analytica exists was because people felt that they weren't progressive, and therefore they had to try to get more traction for their own company. Thanks.
I thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for that speech. Let's welcome DLO. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep.
My preferred pronouns are she and her, and I prefer my POIs in the chat. Wait, verbally, please. In this case, if everybody's ready. In my rebuttal, I'm going to start with several reclassification and reclarification of today's debate, and then several rebuttals on the government side of the House. Firstly, let's look at why this debate, at the end of the day, is extremely tied to politics and political movements. This is because the success and failure of all social movements and progressive content depends heavily on political opportunities. For instance, LGBTQ plus parades essentially wants the government that has not yet legalized gay marriage or legalized other types of marriage to legalize these marriages and normalize the LGBTQ community, right? This again ties back to political sociology because the only way to promote actual change is by politics. Even saying climate change protests essentially urges the government to take action, right? Every progressive movement or progressive content aims for the change in society, and it is impossible for them to just exist for the sake of it. At the end of the day, this essentially leads to lobbying, tension between two parties, and harming the democracy, which I will explain later. Second, how do social media feeds actually work in today's debate? We tout that algorithms and used by apps like Instagram and Twitter, they specifically detect your IP address, your lifestyle, and your preferences in order to recommend content that the user would be interested in. Therefore, these audiences would easily be manipulated and deceived by fraudulent content. Social media lacks proper management of progressive content, meaning that quote-unquote progressive content can still be extreme and untrue, affecting people who are ill-informed. What does the government tell you so far? They told you two things. Firstly, progressive content is beneficial as they push social movement. What is problematic with that? First, they lack characterization of what progressive content will actually look like, right? All they say is that we're supporting social movements and spreading political progressive content. What have we told you about this already in our characterization? First, it is not only harmless campaigns because it involves so many political related aspects that politicians can use to push for progressive campaigns, and also unintentionally and intentionally implanting implanting voting address issues in people's minds. Second, social movements who quote unquote push for change in society are political incentivized, right? Therefore, under both circumstances with this debate, following our link for the first argument, on the government side, when they are pushing for mass manipulation by pushing progressive content, this causes information overload and users that receive these feeds being overwhelmed and manipulated by progressive content. Why this bad? We tell that regular users are not completely rational, as the government side again failed to recognize. They're unable to classify what is right and what is wrong, wrong social media, right? Therefore, when progressive political campaigns give out broad information to appeal to citizens to vote for them, instead of being informed with the whole picture, the users are seeing parts and bits of it, which only creates an echo chamber and jeopardizes people's rationality when voting and engaging in politics, eventually harming democracy, which essence is based on voters and being able to see the full picture and giving both parties voice and choice. What are the impacts? First, we tell you that essentially this harms democracy. Uninformed voters voting and participating in political and social protests based on something that people intentionally planted in their heads in social media is bad, right? But more importantly, that just genuinely creates more extremists on both sides of the political spectrum. Lack of regulations on the content of social media means that people can see people that are pro-abortion rights, but also people that are Nazis. Being exposed to all these information means that they're essentially creating more irrational voters and more extremists in the political community. Before I go on, sure.
In status quo, conservatives are seen as not progressive because many of them view their beliefs as too radical. Therefore, why is it likely that on our side, these conservatives won't try to tone down on their views and try to appeal to the common people, therefore allowing less polarity?
We tell you that on both sides, we see this happening, right? However, we are stressing that the information posed by both ends of the political spectrum could likely be jeopardizing and could likely be leading people into wrong directions and would likely be would likely to be politicized identities, right? This is essentially harmful, as my first speaker has already mentioned in her speech. Recognizing a Black person using Instagram doesn't mean that we should push them and feed them content saying that vote for this candidate and make sure the Black community gets more funding. And if they don't vote for the candidate, they're harming their people. Also, a politicized identity, it's generally basically defining people into groups in the social and political arena, such as pro and con, allies or opponents. This is so problematic in today's debate because this not only promotes lobbying, this not only promotes echo chambers, but also harms the political system and harms the incentives for people to vote in general, right? Second, they tell you that the government has the responsibility and right to manipulate citizens. Notice that this progressive content is genuinely not provided by the government, but instead social activists and political extremists and activists who want the attention of the government and who wants to promote change and stir the political dynamic, right? People who can have different intentions when implanting these information on social media, right? They then tell you how these contents are never fake news because the platforms filter these information. This is simply not true, right? Firstly, fake news is relative. Propagandas are fake news, but they don't get filtered in most of the social media platforms. Secondly, platforms genuinely lack administration and anything can be posted here. People can come out and say climate change is not real and still get hits and feed it to others. They say that this is symmetrical on our side, which is not true. Fake news exists at a much higher scale on their side because their side is when pushing these political progressive contents, progressive campaigns uniquely get the incentive to pass out more fake news to get voters on their side because they now see them as their better herd. This uniquely leads to more conservatives being forced to gain tension with the other side of the political party, right? But even if it does exist, their side are still uniquely manipulating people with fake news. And what if government side eventually told you at today's debate. They say that users are giving consent to their data being taken, so this is symmetrical on both sides of the house. But what exactly is problematic? Us are users that never get politically incentivized and manipulated on our side, right? They still get contents, they still get feeds according to their interests, but this is simply less harmful and simply does not create that big of an impact on our side of the house, right? Essentially, they're not only jeopardizing the people themselves by unintentionally pushing them to one political party or another, but also harming the political system in general. For these reasons, so proud to oppose.
I thank the DLO for that speech. Let's welcome Government Whip. Here.
Can I be heard?
Yep.
Okay, give me a moment. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Notice that opposition's case is pretty much contingent on one thing. Politicization is a bad thing, but it never actually told us why it's better on that side. We cannot just list out harms and run away from it. Therefore, we suggest that opposition has to defend the status quo, and as long as we suggest that politicization is not a bad thing, their case already fails. I think that they fundamentally have a really weird conceptualization of our case. Firstly, what does progressive content look like? We've already proved that it's determined by the majority, therefore things like backlash are very unlikely. Secondly, how do these news feeds look like? Our second speaker took out that problem of fake news. Given that they concede that an algorithm exists, why is it likely that these fake news will be filtered out? Moreover, we think that status quo is actually really bad. Social movements generally lack traction because of conservatives. They themselves concede that hate exists, and therefore that's exactly what stops these social movements from progressing. Is that people get so angry, feel the need to go out and rally and disrupt social movements, therefore not enabling these social movements to get any form of progressive change because everything is just so disruptive that it's just too much noise. Therefore, on our side, we've already proven how we reduce this amount of noise, but I'll be re-emphasizing it later on in my flashes. Side opposition does not solve this issue and has not given any mechanisms of how they would allow for social movements to gain more traction, nor did they prove why they don't see the need to solve the issue of social movements not gaining traction currently in the status quo. Right, 2 clashes in today's debate. Firstly, which side is able to get more traction, and secondly, the idea of social media platforms, an actor that we see side opposition has forgotten about in today's debate. Right, first clash, which side gets more traction? That side has not provided a counterfactual, has not provided it, and we see that if they provide it later on in third, it will be too late. So then they give us an idea that their side wants to get the conservatives votes. They never prove why we care about the conservatives, since their side denounces the idea of extremism, considering that a lot of the conservatives currently in status quo already conduct a lot of extremist acts. We don't really see what their side is getting towards when you make this kind of idea. And these conservatives wouldn't have gotten into parliament either ways, so therefore we don't really see the importance of preserving their views. These people that want to be conservative can still, exercise their right to say whatever they want, exercise the right to only view conservative content. We're not hindering their ability at all. Considering currently status quo, progressive content is already what is currently being perpetuated a lot more in society. Conservative people are aware that they are the minority. In this case, that side does not defend status quo, and that side is required to defend status quo. Why necessarily conservatives on their side won't continue these extremist acts? We see that when they put these harms onto us, they forget about their side. So why is that? So we said that currently the majority of news in society is already
largely progressive. So conservatives on both sides, if they wanted to be angry, if they wanted to rally, if they wanted to be extreme, they would have already been extreme because they are aware that the minority would sit as a big shot. So why is it better on our side? That side says that we have echo chambers, and then because we see bits and pieces of information. We've already characterized how things like political lobbying already happen in status quo. So things like politicization and wanting you to move towards a specific view already exists in status quo. So if seeing things like bits and pieces of information is something that their side wants to take issue with, we see that there's a harm that their side also needs to take on their side. However, on our side, conservatives are less hateful because now we have the incentive to appeal to the majority. If we take on that characterization, the conservatives just want to gain traction. We see that on our side, when we promote progressive content as the norm, and we promote it on social media platforms are uniquely the site where everyone is able to say whatever they want. So now when we also persuade these social media platforms to promote progressive content, that is different on our side, and therefore now conservatives will have to take their only platform where they were able to express their views and now have to cater towards the majority. You see that on our side, therefore people are a lot less likely to be extreme. However, on that side brings to us the idea of echo chambers. On that side, we see that they actually have more echo chambers, considering now people are able to talk a lot more. Their point is that social media platforms are not mediated, are unmoderated. So therefore, we see that on their side is even more unmoderated. The point at which everyone's able to say whatever they want, the point at which there is no common ground, the point at which these news are not moderated. We see that the progressive news is what people ultimately support as the majority, and therefore on our side, we characterize Nation and Joanne that the people we're trying to appeal towards are those people that are on the fence. We see that those people that are hinging towards either side of the spectrum, either of the extreme sides, either very, very progressive or either very, very conservative, are not going to change their views either way. So the people that we're trying to persuade, are the people that are currently on the fence. These people that are currently on the fence are going to take in all this information, make a rational decision, and therefore decide based on that. We see that these people on the fence are currently the people that we lose out on and we lose out on their vote, considering right now on their side there's so much noise that the point at which they do not know how to make a rational decision. And even if on our side they aren't able to make a rational decision because of all this government propaganda, we see that we don't care. The point at which the change that we get is something that's progressive. Their side has never responded to the idea about why progressive change is bad, and they never talked about why these conservatives voice necessary matter to such a great extent and to such a larger extent more than what the majority wants, that is already considered as something that's progressive, something that is good for society. Then the side comes to tell us that people can't make informed votes. Why do we care? I've said this before, is because it's progressive. Why do we not care? If it's progressive and better for society, we don't care whether we miss out on these conservative votes. And that side also has things like data tracking. So when that side brings up this idea of like infringing on people's privacy, we see that this is harm that's symmetrical on both sides, considering both sides also has this idea of data tracking. So what does our side get? Our side gets more social movement progress because we have greater critical mass. Because now we're able to appeal to the people on the fence that otherwise would not have swung towards either sides of the social spectrum. So second question today's debate: social media platforms. Forgotten in today's debate. What is within the social media platform's incentive currently in today's society? We've characterized in Joanne that currently social media platforms have the incentive to make themselves seem more trustworthy towards the people, because that's the only point at which their advertising will continue to work. So that side has rejected all the characterization we've given to you right from first speaker, that currently people already vilify social media platforms, therefore things like advertising currently don't work, because people look at the advertising, they feel very disgusted because they feel that, oh, this is them bringing us dry of our data and using it for their own profit. The point at which on our side, we give these social media platforms a different incentive structure, make them look as if they want to promote progressive content. This is the point at which advertising on our side will work a lot better. Yes, advertising happens on both sides, data exploitation happens on both sides, but only on our side are we better able to maximize the amount of profit that we get from these advertising, because we increase the amount of trust that we have in social media movements. This, if we take it ourselves at the worst case, this is the one benefit that that side has never really responded to, and we see that even if we use everything else, we have this unique benefit. And therefore, we said that side has ignored a very important factor in today's debate. Right, the two things that we've proven in today's debate is that we're able to gain traction for societal movements, and at our worst case, we still share the same amount of harms that that side needs to take on that side. With this, please go with government. Thank you.
I thank the government whip for that speech. Let's welcome opposition whip. Sorry, sir.
Hi, give me just 1 second to set up my time.
Of whip.
I'm sorry, I think she's having some technical issues and I'm contacting her right now.
Hi, am I audible now? Hello?
Yes. Hi, yes, you're audible.
Oh, hi. Extremely sorry. Okay. So if everyone's ready, my time starts on my next word. What is the main clash in this debate? Politicalization of social media platforms and why this is so bad. Let's do some clarifications in this debate because government side never really gets the correct characterization. Why is this debate about politics and not just harmless social movements? One, progressive content includes politicians hoping to push for progressive campaigns. What is the problem with this? Those progressive politicians have the incentive to appeal to citizens to get votes, right? So therefore, they voice things in an extremely vague way that only misleads people. But why do conservatives uniquely counter this so much on the government side? This is because on their side, conservatives are not able to be heard as they're solely pushing for progressive thoughts. And therefore, conservatives become extremely political. But on the other side of the spectrum, which are of the progressive political campaigns, and this would only lead to even more misinformation, unique impact to the government side. They cannot tell you that this is symmetrical to our side. But secondly, social movements are tied to politics too. Therefore, solely claiming that they allow for benefits to social movements to be better heard does not work because it would only lead to more politicalization uniquely on their side, which we have already told you is bad. So why are politicalization on social media so bad? So the government misses out on how people are not able to make rational decisions because people on the fence are easily swayed by campaigns, and the campaigns are designed to sway people, especially as characterized before. Progressive politicians have passed very vague ideas, which lead to more misinformation because they're trying to appeal to citizens, and this would only sway more people into voting for wrong political parties. So why is politicalization on social media so bad? One, politicalization on social media creates two things. So they create echo chambers by giving people what they want to see and nothing else. Regular people without much judgments to what the full picture actually looks like could end up being fed more and more content that is untrue or designed specifically to meet the needs of these people. But secondly, they create even more extremists on articulator on their side of the house by implementing wrong information or extreme information on one side of the party. They could end up making conservative people more conserved and progressive activists even more extreme. So it is just generally jeopardizing the people and democratic system in a much larger scale on their side. Sure, I'll take your point right now.
Hi, if your claim is that progressive politicians have vague ideas, why are conservative politicians a better actor on your side now that we need to give them a voice?
We never tell you that they're a better actor, right? We tell you that progressive politicians have a very vague way of voicing out what they hope for because they're trying to appeal to citizens. As mentioned in the very top of this debate by our first speaker, progressive politicians cannot just not everyone can be pushing for abortion rights, and they voice this in a very vague way because they're trying to appeal to citizens. So therefore, this would only lead to less conservative politicians to be heard, and this is what uniquely on your side causes them to voice out in a more extreme way to become more conservative to be heard, right? So now let's move on to our So now let's move on to the second problem. So we tell you that this is harming people because since once they're planted with information voluntarily under their side of this house, once they believe these informations and make actions towards them, they're not only harmed by themselves because the lack of right of information, but also they harm the democratic system as a whole, right? Therefore, the government's entire case falls because we prove to them that social media are social media being politicalized on their side, why social media are politicized uniquely on their side, and why this is so bad. So let's address their second argument, which they claim that we never respond to. They say that they're gaining trust for the social media platforms. Again, this will never happen on their side of this debate. People see vague political thoughts being passed. People see a much more radicalized social media, and people see conservative thoughts, like conservative politicians passing more and more conservative thoughts on their side. So on their side, what they're doing is they have no middle ground to politics, right? All they're doing is causing more extreme thoughts on both sides of this, politics. Sure, I'll take your point.
Given that given that a lot of things that are popular are considered as radical by you guys, why is it likely that on your site social media news feeds aren't already so-called radical?
We tell you that it's not radical on our side because we uniquely do not push and manipulate and push for progressive contents to be passed so much, right? On their side, we still have progressive contents, but we just feed them to the users normally. So on your side of this debate, you're the side that actually push for such progressive content, which leads to conservative politicians not being heard, which leads to them passing more conservative thoughts. So this is the link on our side, which you never get. But secondly, even if people do trust social media platforms more on their side, why is this so bad? Because social media platforms are now politicalized, right? So we tell you that this is just harming the people because once they fully trust the social media platforms, they are even more easily swayed on their side of this debate because people would only be trusting all the information that social media platforms feed them, and therefore they would simply be not even more irrational. So like at the end of the day, they're the side that actually harms the social movements more by causing people to agree to more extreme ideas. So let's give a comparative at the end of the day. On their side, they have extremely political views. On their side, people cannot be rational voters. This means no for progressiveness, which is the only thing they were pushing for on their side of this debate. Whereas on our side, we feed normal content to people, as well as just normally feeding conservative campaigns and progressive campaigns and progressive content to people, which is what uniquely allows those users to actually think more rationally comparatively to their side, which once they give full trust to the social media, it only undermines the entire democratic system by causing people to vote irrationally. Therefore, proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the opposition whip for that speech. Let's invite opposition reply here.
After 3 speeches from Prop, they still have yet to explain to us how social media platforms can be regulated well enough that democracy can still properly function on their side of the house and that users can be informed, impartial voters. If you don't allow users to access the middle ground, well, then they will naturally be forced to the extreme. They assert to us that voters are rational actors and that they can handle all the misinformation and fake news that exists. We don't think this is true. There are so many first-time voters, young people, and given that only 40% of people even vote in the US, there's no justification to as why these people will even take the time to learn about both sides. Prop told us that we never characterized their counterfactual. They just never listened to what we said. And first, we told you that there's a lack of regulation on hate speech, on how political campaigns can go with spreading misinformation. This means that conservatives, radical extremists will start heavier misinformation campaigns to fight against this progressive-leaning algorithm, and also then migrate to other social media sites that grow an even more dangerous, violent, and radical movement of Trump supporters who hate minorities, want to overrun the Capitol, believe the election is stolen, and want to kill their vice president and Biden. Equally then, if not more important, moderate social movements won't be able to gain any traction as well under their side of the house because they also don't fit the progressive narrative that social media really likes. This means then that in their counterfactual, there will be more desperate conservatives who still want to reach out to the billions of Facebook and social media users to post more and outrun these sites with their propaganda, making it very hard for any average user to handle. On the problem with regulation then, Gov never told us how social media can be properly regulated so that big data is not misused. Their DPM gave us an example of Cambridge Analytica. We flipped this in that we think that essentially if you want to repeat what happened with this scenario, where big data from surveys was taken without consent or transparency to then micro-target users and politicize their identities, their race, their gender, to grow Trump's campaign and following and sway them to vote for him, their side gets it worse because conservatives will also want to access what the progressives have, which is an unfair promotion platform through the social media algorithm and misusing big data. On privacy then, note that they concede that in order for progressive content to be pushed, movements must take big data and micro-target users through advanced analytics. We think this is simply wrong to do, and this point wins us the debate because we've proven to you that how, with the lack of regulation under their side, which means that there can be repeat offenses of misusing data and infringing on personal privacy in order to get more votes, and then politicizing and antagonizing people's identities and telling them that they, as a Black person, must vote for Biden because only the Democrats care about them, or that they will lose all their rights if they don't, that this will also then harm social movements because then it will go to the extremes, and that if you are Black, you must go one way, and if you are Black and you go the other way, then you are not supporting your community. Then on the democratic principles, we say that informed voters, active voters, and the participation of all individuals, no matter what political side they support, is important in order for proper democratic engagement. It shouldn't be that we have to exclude and radicalize these conservatives and antagonize the moderates for not being a full-blown progressive. Under their side, social media sites only appeal to progressive campaigns, pushing biased amounts of information, and voters would also not see issues, for example, with the Democratic politicians who steal insider trade deal information or who supported the war on drugs 40 years ago and are still racist because the algorithm knows not to push that information because it would harm these progressive politicians. This means that that there's a lack of accountability for these radical progressive campaigns or general progressive campaigns, and that in the best case of their comparative, there's also then a lack of foundation for democracy. They tell us that they think there are more people who will support progressive movements. And if that is true, we think that under our side of the house, that engagement will naturally be picked up by the algorithm that is unbiased, and that these movements will still be seen because there are still supporters who are actively engaging with the content. And we can reach more users who are, for example, the undecided, who are slightly leaning conservatives, and we get more political action. We allow for information to be consumed by these users in a fair and impartial way. Therefore, proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition reply for that speech. Let's welcome government reply. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep.
All right. There is one main clash in today's debate. Which side is justified in the use of data collector? Side opposition came up to us today and gave us two lines of argument. Firstly, that using data to push out progressive content will cultivate more fake news, and secondly, that there will be politicization of progressive content. What was our response to both of these arguments? Firstly, political lobbying. The DLO wanted to talk about political lobbying, but they never actually explained it, and I think that my second speaker has given you a couple of good reasons as to why political lobbying doesn't matter anyway and happens anyway. So throughout our three speakers, we told you that opposition is forced to defend status quo. They never gave us a counterfactual. They never told us why their side can do better, and we gave you pretty good reasons why status quo isn't working. Social movements generally lack traction because of conservatives. We told you in Kara that conservatives actively denounce and go against these movements, hindering change, and there was no response. This also directly deals with their argument of politicization. Social media companies are pretty manipulative because they are currently vilified in status quo. But furthermore, note that their word is actually pretty unclear. They never told us what fake news looked like. They never told us what newsfeed looks like. And we know that their case is pretty much isn't exclusive because the debate is about the impact of newsfeeds, not politicization. They never proved why recommended newsfeeds is distinct from the newsfeeds in status quo. They cannot claim that there is simply a difference. We told you pretty clearly in a QI that they needed to draw this difference. If newsfeeds are really considered radical, according to their logic, because radical newsfeeds are considered are sensationalized, why does this change on their side? Meanwhile, we painted recommended news feeds pretty clearly. We told you that in status quo, these social movements would never be recommended in news feed to other users, to these users if they don't show explicit interest in the movement. While on our side, because of these recommended news feeds, we are pushing out the sort of content that's so crucial for users to read but aren't often pushed out. So thus, in today's debate, the opposition's case is contingent on one thing, politicization. This was extremely unstrategic on their side because as long as we prove that the harms of politicization isn't as important, and secondly, politicization is a good thing, their whole case pretty much falls. But we're going to take them at their best and prove why even so they lose in every aspect. Firstly, they cannot claim that social movements is distinct from politics. Note that they never dealt with this. They cannot claim that they get more traction in reply as well. It's too late. We told you that pretty clearly in second that political campaigns are often based on social movements in the first place. Because if people generally regard social movements as progressive, for example, if people campaign for workplace rights for women, then surely something is wrong. Politicians want votes, so they try to appeal to progressive things in general. They never responded to this. Thus, this means that we actually get more progressive change on our side. But I think that they already have made a crucial contradiction in their case. If your claim is that progressive politicians have vague ideas, why are conservative politicians a good actor? They didn't prove this. We told you pretty clearly that progressive things is seen as what the majority views is important. But we also told you that we turn conservative politicians into better actors on our side. We told you that we actually reduce hate in second and third. We told you that these conservative politicians are forced to be less radical to gain more support. They cannot assert that hate exists. Gaining traction from movements, there was no response to this either. So why is politicization a good thing? The politicians have the power to lobby as those that have been in power for a long time. Thus, the majority already likes them, and these politicians have the incentive to appeal to the majority and thus be progressive. Thus, we have more progressive legislation. We don't care if we knock out conservatives because they don't impact as to why the conservatives vote is so important. Currently, popular movements are the ones that have the highest likelihood of getting legislative change. So on the idea of fake news, just like we told you pretty clearly in second that it's unclear why fake news only exists on our side. On our side, fake news is filtered out because it's generally seen as non-progressive content. If it's progressive content, then people would support. Why would fake news be needed then? On their side, fake news exists because they never told us their counterfactual changes this. No response to this. And so we proved that it's less, and therefore they wanted to talk about political lobbying in DRO. But they never really said anything about it, and my second already dealt with this. And for all these reasons, because we are able to prove that some change could happen on our side, we already take this debate.
I thank the government's reply for that fine speech, and I thank all of you for a great first out round. I now request all the speakers to please leave this breakout room and